Welcome everyone to the inaugural Youth and the Future of AI conference. We have over 650 registrations, which is quite exceptional. My name is Saif Malam, and I am a member of the team at the AI Future Lab. We are deeply excited to host this conference. The reception has been very positive, which only tells that the next gen leaders and the global youth are just as excited to be a central stakeholder in the global AI conversation. This conference is the youth's first step towards imprinting their values, beliefs, and hopes for a prosperous future through AI, because we know that the digital infrastructure we develop today will shape our futures for decades, if not centuries to come. So we gather now to articulate what we believe should be core to AI to ensure equity, life, and liberty for all humankind, and bypass mistakes made with previous industrial revolutions. On the first day, we will host sessions in collaboration with the World Bank's Connect for Climate, as well as the Lancet and Financial Times Commission on Governing Health Futures 2030. We will also have sessions on varying topics from public engagement in AI to fintech to art to data colonialism and more. And then on the second day, the global youth will convene from all 7 regions to craft the world's youth AI manifesto. The AI Future Lab is an artificial intelligence lab built by youth for youth. The lab's mission is to empower the global youth and next-gen leaders to develop responsible AI, to democratize access to shaping its trajectory, and to ensure the inclusion of global communities. The lab creates a unified space for leadership, research, data-driven projects, networking, and community building around artificial intelligence for young people around the world. Covering 6 continents, the AI Future Lab started with a community of over 120 youth leaders from over 30 cities spanning various professional backgrounds, and it's continuously growing. So without further ado, I will pass it on to one of our great team members and the moderator of the first session, AI and the Future of Peace, Mayel. Mayel, the floor is all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Saif. Everyone, welcome to this first session on the future of peace. When we talk about AI, there's usually a mix of excitement and fear that comes into play, but I trust that most of us will be rather concerned about what we'll be discussing for the coming hour. After gunpowder and nuclear weapons, AI indeed brings a new era for global security and warfare. From the use of AI to disrupt democracies to the deployment of lethal autonomous weapons, we do indeed have reasons to be concerned. So how should we address the risk of the ongoing global quest for military, economic, and AI dominance? Is there room for the regulation of lethal autonomous weapons? Are we members of civil society powerless? And finally, can your philosophy help us find some answers? To nourish this discussion, I'm honored to introduce 4 distinguished panelists who truly reflect the diversity of actors engaging with this issue. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Nayef Al Rodan. He's a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a geostrategist. He was educated at the Mayo Clinic, Yale University, and Harvard University, and is now an honorary fellow of the St. Anthony's College at Oxford University, senior fellow and head of the Geopolitics and Global Futures program at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, senior research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy in the School of Advanced Studies of the University of London, and a member of the Council on Frontier Risks at the World Economic Forum. He's a prize-winning scholar and has been voted among the top 30 most influential neuroscientists in the world, and has written 22 books and 250 articles. Professor Al Rodan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I would like now to introduce Senior Fellow Anya Kaspersen. She's a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. She's the former director of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva and Deputy Direct Secretary General of the Conference on Disarmament. Previously, she held the role of Head of Strategic Engagement and New Technologies at the ICRC, and prior to joining the ICRC, she served as Senior Director for Geopolitics and International Security and as member of the Executive Committee at the World Economic Forum. Senior Fellow Kaspersen, thank you as well so much for accepting to join us.
Thank you.
And finally, as rather third, I would like to introduce Dr. Nikos Loutas. He's the head of NATO's Data and AI Policy Unit. The Data and AI Policy Unit is responsible for advocating, leading, and helping manage the responsible use of data and AI for NATO. It provides policy leadership and drives policy adoption by establishing high-level frameworks and enablers to empower NATO to draw value from data, both open source and generated by NATO and its allies, with a focus on alliance operations and missions. Before joining NATO, Dr. Lutas was a data policy officer in the European Commission's Secretariat General, coordinating the implementation of the Commission's data and data policies governance. Dr. Lutas, thank you very much for accepting to be part of this discussion as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good morning, everyone.
And finally, but not least, I'd like to introduce Ms. Isabel Jones. She is the Campaign Outreach Manager for Stop Killer Robots. Stop Killer Robots is a global coalition of more than 185 member organizations working to ensure human control in the use of force and campaigning for new international law on autonomy in weapons systems. Ms. Jones joined the campaign to stop killer robots in June 2018 as its first full-time staff member. And previously, she worked in various roles at the Aga Khan Foundation Canada, the LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security, and the LSE Center for Human Rights, and also Human Rights Watch. Mrs. Jones, thank you as well very much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And to kickstart a little bit the discussion, I'd like to turn to you, Mrs. Jones, first. Overall, why should we care at all about killer robots? Because after all, some people may fairly argue that in times of wars, robots are the least of our concerns, or rather that whatever developments can be made at the present time will have little if no impact on us today in peacetime. So what is your answer to that?
Well, it will be of no surprise that I think there are many reasons that we need to care about killer robots. We should care about killer robots because we need to draw a clear legal and moral line around life and death decision-making by machines. It's kind of that clear red line that should not be crossed. Machines should not be given, must not be given the power to decide to kill people. We should care about killer robots because they pose a risk, a fundamental risk, an urgent risk to our shared humanity, to human dignity, to concepts of how international humanitarian law is applied. And because they represent what has been called the revolution in warfare, that undermines meaningful human control of the use of force. But I think also we should care about killer robots because in a way, our response to the risks that they pose and this technology pose speaks, I think, to our ability more broadly to shape and respond to emerging and high-risk technologies that we're developing and how to shape the rules that govern those types of technologies. So just to go briefly a little bit more into that, I think that it's fair to say around the world, throughout societies, we're seeing a growing influence of computer processing, algorithmic thinking, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and across all aspects of life. And, in a kind of solutionist or optimistic way, these technologies are often presented as prioritizing precision and efficiency and speed and making our lives easier and better. And, in some cases that can be true, but technology isn't neutral. It is entirely dependent on the ways that it's designed and the ways that it's implemented and used and regulated. And we've already seen the influence of some of this kind of techno-optimistic thinking, I think, in things like the proliferation of drones and remote warfare, the use of facial recognition systems and surveillance systems, mass data collection by policing agencies or border control systems. And often, I think these solutions can be put forward without due consideration or care given to things like data biases that are present in developing and building this technology, or the consequences of what it means to remove, human understanding of context and nuance from decision making, and what the kind of knock-on effects of that can be. And we've already seen, over the past several years, a lot of discussion about this in the areas of AI ethics and AI justice more broadly. So for us and for me, I think coming back to the issue of killer robots, we kind of view that as the ultimate manifestation of this process or potential process of digital dehumanization. So when I talk about killer robots and when the Coalition to Stop Killer Robots uses that phrase, what we're really talking about is a range of weapon systems that can detect and apply force to a target based on sensor inputs rather than direct human inputs. So that's the range of systems that we call autonomous weapons. And with an autonomous weapon or a killer robot, after the human user activates that system, there's a period of time where the weapon can apply force to a target without direct human approval. So what this means is that in the case of killer robots or autonomous weapons, the specific target or object to be attacked and the time and the place of that attack are determined by sensor processing, not by humans, which means less direct human engagement and understanding of what's happening, less situational awareness, and of course, getting closer to machines making decisions over whom to kill when we think about the possibility of those being human targets. So I could go on about this for a very long time, but I'll just kind of high level some of the numerous concerns that we have around killer robots and kind of the threat that they pose to our shared humanity in our view. So of course, there are ethical and moral concerns that I've already touched on around delegating life and death decision-making to machines and the dehumanizing effect and erosion of human dignity that could have. There's also a host of technical concerns, so related to things like unpredictability and understandability of systems, vulnerability to bias, hacking, spoofing, other technical failures, and of course, the risk of algorithmic bias, and thousands of roboticists and technologists, researchers in AI and machine learning have raised concerns around these areas of kind of technical failures. There's also a threat to international humanitarian law and kind of the accountability gap that's posed by autonomous weapons. So in the event of an error, who is held accountable for that when the decision to take or use force is not made directly by human? There's also concern that autonomous weapons would lack the necessary human judgment to apply international human rights law and international humanitarian law, because those laws were created to be used and applied to humans, and machines, autonomous weapons, don't have the human judgment necessary to do things like evaluate the proportionality of an attack or distinguish civilians from combatants, or abide by those other core principles of IHL or IHRL. And of course, there's always concern that with no regulation, and we already know that autonomy is present to some level in different weapon systems in development and in use. If there's no kind of regulation of these systems, we could quickly see ourselves entering a destabilizing period or international environment of greater proliferation, and likely also see the trickle down of those weapons to domestic contexts like policing and border control. So I think to kind of wrap it up, we should care about killer robots because our humanity, our complex identities, our communities, they shouldn't be reduced to things like physical features or patterns of behavior to be analyzed, pattern matched, and targeted, because that's ultimately what happens when we move to a system of sensor processing rather than human decision making. And that certainly shouldn't be done by weapon systems that are unable to understand the concepts of life and human rights and dignity, which are fundamental when you're thinking about the moral decision making and moral responsibility that comes from engaging in violence. And we believe that the only way to really successfully address the concerns that are raised by killer robots is through a comprehensive and legally binding treaty, which would prohibit systems that would be unacceptable and ensure meaningful human control in the use of force of other systems through the use of positive obligations or regulations. But I think we're probably going to get more into that later in the discussion. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jones, for these different concerns. And I would like to turn now to you, Dr. Lutas. We understand from Ms. Jones that the developments of AI military applications in particular present dangers as well to us from some kind of digital dehumanization. But putting ourselves in the shoes of nation states now, how is AI challenging, or rather expected to challenge, the alliance security landscape, and what is the answer of the alliance to that?
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the question. As Ms. Jones already explained, AI is really one of the most pervasive technologies to date, right? And especially when combined with other technologies like big data, like quantum computing, like biotechnologies. And therefore, at NATO, we first of all see AI as a key enabler for also leveraging emerging technologies. And that's something that is part of our broader emerging and disruptive technology strategy. What we also realize, and it's a very important factor in the discussion, is that AI has become an area of strategic competition as well. And this is not just recognized by the Alliance, but also by our adversaries who see the importance of these new technologies, who invest heavily in AI and machine learning and this family of technologies for military and defense purposes. If you, for example, see the investment that China is making in this area, it's really growing significantly year by year. So artificial intelligence is a key factor of change in this global defense and security landscape. And that's something that NATO has been reflecting on and thinking about already since 2018, when we already identified data as a strategic asset and AI as one of the key pillars for modernizing the alliance and for making sure that we need to act in order to maintain our technology edge. So activities began since then to establish the necessary policies and strategies that would, on the one hand, allow us to leverage the benefits of data, AI, and machine learning, but also on the other hand, to manage the risks of those technologies. And that actually brought us to October 2021, when the defense ministers of the 30 allied nations endorsed NATO's AI strategy and an associated data exploitation policy. And those two combined together are a very comprehensive answer of the alliance towards using data and AI for the interests of NATO and also as part of our wider technology efforts. We believe that data and AI will allow NATO to, first of all, fully benefit from the vast and diverse data sets that we are collecting, managing, and using as an organization and as an alliance. We believe also that data and AI will help us to strengthen, of course, our deterrence and defense posture before even going and talking about military operations. And that's also very important. And then, of course, making sure that we strengthen our technological edge and that we are really on top of our game. Data and AI technologies will help us be more effective in the field, of course, but they will also help us reduce costs, for example, in maintaining assets and equipment, in staffing. They will also help us take better informed political decisions. And that's also a key enabler that we see when we're talking about the application of artificial intelligence at NATO. It will help us improve our situational awareness. It can help us deal better with hybrid attacks, with cyber threats, or even with climate change. So the potential of the technology is very, very big. Of course, as the previous speaker also said, we should not approach this in a somehow completely naive manner. And we do recognize, of course, that AI multiplies also the challenges we face. And those challenges may relate on the one hand, of course, on the somehow responsible use of artificial intelligence and data. On the other hand, the challenges also relate on or come from the use of those technologies from our adversaries, by our adversaries. So if you talk about smarter weapons or autonomous weapons, or also below the threshold threats, such as cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns that are increasingly being used in place of military actions. So NATO's AI strategy, just to give you a nutshell and a public summary, is available on our website, is centered around 4 key goals. The first one is that we would like to accelerate and mainstream AI adoption in capability development and delivery within the alliance. And when we talk about AI, we refer to the broader family of technologies, including also machine learning and possibly also analytics. We would like also to protect and monitor our AI developments and technologies, and that is also a part of what our strategy is looking at. We want to make sure that we will identify and safeguard against the licit and illicit use of technologies, especially those developed by and for NATO. And of course, our fourth key goal relates directly to our ambition and intention to encourage the development and use of AI in a responsible manner. So our strategy is a lot about setting standards for defense applications of AI. And we do believe that NATO can lead the way in establishing common rules for the use of AI. We actually are able, because of our nature and the fact that we bring together 30 sovereign states, to provide a platform for such discussions. What we would also like to do is develop guidelines through the implementation of the strategy on how to govern AI systems responsibly. For example, by ensuring that systems can be shut down by a human at any time, to ensure that there's a human in the middle, especially in cases where that is necessary. What is also very important is that 30 sovereign states came together to express their views and agree on principles of responsible use of AI. And this is in itself a very strong statement, a very strong expression coming for 30 countries, and also demonstrating that NATO as a whole is united and committed to actually work on that together as an alliance. What we also wanted to make sure is that the world gets to know about those intentions, and that the world somehow develops trust in the way NATO aims at using AI. And therefore, we actually made those principles public, and also a public summary of our AI strategy, as I said. When we are looking at implementing the strategy, what we really want to capitalize on are actually the strengths of our alliance. We have 30 allies. Most of them have incredible research and development expertise across defense and civilian sectors in the area of technology and artificial intelligence, very strong universities, a strong private industry. So it's a unique place and a unique combination of capabilities to develop AI the right way. What is also important for us is to strengthen cooperation when it comes to testing and verifying AI applications, and making sure that those applications actually apply the principles of responsible use that are in the strategy, but also other principles that have to do with their proper use of data and technology. Mm-hmm. The Alliance aims to integrate artificial intelligence in an interoperable way to support our 3 core tasks. And of course, we are committed to do that in accordance with international law. Lawfulness is actually one of our principles. At the same time, we recognize the leading role of the civil-private sector and academia in data and AI developments. So for us, it is very important to cooperate not only between the NATO allies, but also with the private sector, with academia and other international organizations. We really believe that AI development, AI governance is a matter of international cooperation, not something that we can do alone. We're looking also at how can we prepare our workforce to work with AI-driven services, to work with AI, to work with in a context of data and AI-driven decision-making. So a lot of effort is being put into upskilling our staff, but also making sure we attract and retain the right talent. And of course, AI is nothing without the right data. So we're also investing on making sure we have a robust and secure data infrastructure, both in terms of training data, but also our operational data that then we can use for feeding into our AI models. And of course, as I said, security is very important. So making sure the appropriate cyber defense is in place is equally important for us. For NATO, making sure that those commitments do not remain words on paper is of fundamental interest. So we want to make sure that tackling those challenges turns quickly into action, and it requires a a thoughtful and iterative approach actually to make this happen. It requires identifying the right use cases. It requires piloting projects, developing or acquiring data and AI skills, designing and implementing our different capabilities, making sure we have the right platforms, making sure we have the right relationships with our vendors and the industry. What we also see as a key role there and a key task for us is to participate in efforts that aim at regulating AI technology. And what we see there is that actually, because most of the innovation currently within the AI environment is happening within the civilian sector, it means also that civilian technology and regulation will also have an impact on the ability we can use AI and on the ability to defend ourselves. And therefore, it's very important for us to be part of the discussion and to cooperate also with civilian bodies in this context. And again, this does not include only government or international organizations, but also industry and technology vendors, as well as standard setting bodies who are working, for example, on standards for responsible AI, on assessment methods and processes, and all the necessary tools and instruments.
Okay, Dr. Lutas, I think we're going to have to move to the next question, if you allow me. But you were on the point of mentioning collaboration, and I'd like now to turn to you, Senior Fellow Casperson, because we understand that there are inherent limits to what states can do or are to a certain extent willing to do to address the ethical concerns that are being brought by this issue. And that's also that's the very nature of things as well. Is it a task maybe that is better assumed by the international community as a whole? And is this international community also today equipped to address these security and humanitarian challenges posed by AI? What are your views on that? You're currently on mute.
That's a classic sentence of beginning of every sentence these days. No, first, thank you so much for inviting me. And, I think it's fantastic to see that the AI Future Lab is doing this event, and, also that the demography, the age of those engaging, is slightly different than some of the discussions that I participate in. So this is a really fabulous initiative. So I'm happy to be part of it. So allow me to backtrack a little bit, because you did refer to, my work on ethics. And just to sort of set the scene, I just want to, the short answer to your question, are we equipped, is yes, and the very famous but. So allow me to focus a little bit on why I say but, and share a few caveats that I believe are impacting our feeling of preparedness and how to go about equipping better, both conceptually, cognitively, and strategically. First, we need to reiterate that technology, including tools and systems benefiting from AI, whether it's used by industry to respond to humanitarian needs, used to gain and strengthen strategic and military advantages, or impact on strategic and international stability, or even to influence human behavior, it is a human story. Too often the debate on novel and disruptive technologies in AI is presented as these transformative tools will evolve on its own separate trajectory. Let me be the first one to say this is not the case. It is human all the way, regardless of the area of application that we're talking about. Every novelty, every challenge, every bias, every value, every opportunity. And we are indeed at an inflection point, but it's definitely a human one, and to some degree a political one, as the previous speaker was referring to, and even a teleological one, but it's not a technological one. It is a story to inspire action, engagement, not feeling anxious or defeated, which I always caution against, which is very easy. I see this a lot in this space. Humans decide what technologies we develop and deploy. This is in danger of being forgotten, and we definitely need to reassert it. So I think this is a great initiative, to be able to reassert that narrative. Second, we need to be mindful of the many narrative traps and rabbit holes, if you may, growing out of the hype, but also the promise of that these novel and disruptive technologies, including AI, provides. One such tech deterministic narrative risk is, coming out of, promoting the scale and pace of these technologies, is that we are seeing a disengagement. There's a sense that there's no way of stopping or mitigating this progress against misuse or bad applications, that all we can do is really get on board, optimize, and proliferate, which is causing decision makers and those in charge of processes to sometimes feel at loss on how to govern, the issues seem to be technical, to be difficult to sort of wrap our minds around, difficult to apply into current, be that normative frameworks, the current governance framework. And I think in a fragile geopolitical landscape that also, previous speaker was speaking of, and also the first speaker was speaking of, in a geopolitical landscape that is as fragile as we're seeing right now, there is increasingly a global context also concerning the ethics, governance, and regulation of both data, AI, other technologies that also impacts on how we view, the autonomous decision and weapon systems issue. A third issue that impacts on our feeling of being sufficiently equipped is the push to focus concern about the direction of technological developments onto existential risks. This suits certain stakeholder groups because existential risks are theoretical and to some quite distant, and too much, in my view, of the general public currently perceives about AI comes from sci-fi tropes and blockbuster movies, essentially. And I find this very concerning as it crowds out attention from near-term risks. And Isabel referred to some of the near-term risks we need to grapple with, the first speaker, in particular as AI is permeating our lives on day-to-day basis. And sometimes, and too often, not just sometimes, but too often, without the necessary checks and balances as to their maturity, the power dynamics, who benefits, announce the output. So I think we need to look beyond the hypothetical risks of future AI and actually start addressing the real and imminent limitations posed by why and how we embed AI systems that currently shape everyone's daily lives and who gets to decide. So going back to my point, it's the human story. Technology is not neutral. AI systems are definitely not apolitical, and we need to be vigilant and aware of whose rules, values, and interests that we are embedding into our technologies. Fourth point is that we need to ensure that we are equipped conceptually and normatively. We need to move away from conceptualizing problems as being in need of solidly technological solutions. The question is not just whether we can develop AI that can solve a problem, but what are the ethical risks of deploying it to solve that problem? When and where is it appropriate to deploy, and who should oversee its effects? And while it's clear that AI systems offer opportunities across various domains and contexts, what amounts to a responsible perspective on their ethics and governance is yet to be realized. And few initiatives that I know of to date, and there are many of them, there's a whole plethora of them, so there's no lack of effort, that's for sure, but few of them have accomplished any real impact in modulating its effects. Unfortunately, that is often due to the fact that despite the good efforts that go into many of these initiatives and guidelines, there's very little focus on implementation and validation, certification, and verification efforts that needs to be underpinning some of these efforts. Now, to the ethics, many of the existing dialogues are too narrow and fail to understand the subtleties and life cycle of AI systems, and there's sometimes limited functionality and therefore also impact. And moreover, and this is a very important point, the scientific methods and complexity underpinning the what, how, and why of how an AI system is built is often poorly understood by those in charge of the process and those in charge of making decisions about how we and when we embed such systems. And I often say, especially reflecting on what we learned from I often say that, it's important to learn from the area of nuclear research, and I think CERN in particular, that we need better lateral, scientific, and anthropological intelligence when we look at these foundational models and future applications of AI. And sixth and lastly, in this introductory round, the AI and algorithmic technologies too often focuses on some aspects of ethics, while ignoring other aspects that are more fundamental and challenging. And this is an issue that we see across the board. For example, what potential might AI systems have to perpetuate existing inequalities and create new ones? This is an area that the Carnegie Council is focusing quite heavily on. So not just looking at from a social equality point of view, but also equality in terms of international affairs. And this is the problem known as ethics washing. And I even tried to come up with a definition of what ethics washing is, which is creating a superficially reassuring but illusory sense that ethical issues are being adequately addressed to justify pressing forward with systems that end up deepening current patterns. And what does ethics mean in this context, you may ask? Well, it means that you can apply an ethical lens to allow you to assess the choices taken, but also the choices not taken. ethics is too often, treated as something very complicated, but it's really just a frame to grapple with the tensions that exist when talking about the trade-offs relating to technologies to perform human tasks or to engage with humans in performing human tasks. And often, those humans that is working with the technology or with the machine, may not be prepared to do so, which also raises, a number of ethical issues where I'll be happy to revisit in our next session. And in other words, how do we equip better to be clear on what aspects of ethics that we are considering and what aspects of ethics are we overlooking, sometimes by design and sometimes by default. But it's very important to be 100% aware, and that is how we remain equipped to be tackling these issues in whatever domain we are talking about. So let me start with that.
Thank you very much, your fellow cast person, for those very interesting points. And I would like to turn now to you, Professor Nayef Al Rodan. In her presentation, senior fellow cast person really stressed the importance that this is a human story indeed. And so I'd like to use this opportunity to ask you, how can your philosophy help us understand better the issues posed by AI warfare, transhumanism?
Thank you, Mael. Thank you, Saif. Very, very happy to be with you all. Thank you, Anya, for propping up the discussion to the human angle. Indeed, it is a human story. I mean, I work at the intersection between neurophilosophy and international relations / geopolitics. So how can neurophilosophical work explain issues posed by AI, transhumanism, and warfare? Maybe I'll start with a quote from DARPA, the US Defense Agency, which said, and I'll quote, that human beings are the weakest link in the defense system. That's a very interesting statement. And this automatically means that you have to do two things to your defense establishment. One, augment capacities of us biological soldiers through biological and or technological means. That's one. And aim to replace biological soldiers for some missions, at least for now, with autonomous artificial intelligent agents, including killer robots. And the offshoot of that is maybe eventually you replace all biological soldiers with these autonomous entities. Now, whether you subscribe to this thesis that biological soldiers are the weak link in the defense establishment or not, it is clear that most advanced militaries, including NATO, are pursuing both avenues. Now, let me digress for a minute or two to ground this at the human level and talk about who are we? What makes us human? What is specific about our humanity? Because that is the platform, as most political theorists in human history have always started with a specific view of human nature in order to conceptualize. And this is highly relevant to autonomous weapons. So my work on this is I have conceptualized that human nature, that we are emotional, amoral egoists. That is most of us, most of the time, just to caveat that, none of this is either deterministic or reductionist, but this is from neuroscientific work and from neurophilosophical reflection is probably the default position. So we are more emotional than rational, but interestingly, this dichotomy, it's not either or. Our most rational of decisions are actually heavily endowed with emotional content. There's clear neuroscientific evidence for that. Most of us, most of the time, are amoral. So we're not immoral, but not moral. But we are capable of all of the above on a kind of, depending on circumstances, mostly personal and political. Our moral compass, as an offshoot of that, is governed primarily by our perceived emotional self-interest. So the prefix of perceived is absolutely critical. So the idea of clarity in what autonomous weapons are or are not is important to understand the consequences. And the upshot of that, for me, from a motivational standpoint, is what I have called the Neuro P5, where I came up with 5 motivators of humankind. First and foremost is power. and that's also relevant to our discussion. Pleasure, profit, that's also relevant because of corporate entities. Pride and permanency. And permanency, what I mean by permanency is partly longevity and partly legacy. As I said, all of the above are influenced by personal and political circumstances. Critical to remember when we talk about human nature are two things. One is our malleability. We're very malleable, but that's good news, bad news. It depends on the milieu we find ourselves in. We could be malleable to destructive acts, and we could be malleable to constructive acts. But we're also very fragile. So malleability and fragility are central to human nature. Two quick words, or three quick words, one on transhumanism, one on neuromodulation and free will, all relevant, and BCI's brain-computer interface, and then I'll end with the autonomous, the outlook, a neurophilosophical outlook for autonomous weapons. Transhumanism, my definition of transhumanism, which is published, is that it's augmentation of capacities, either cognitive and or physical, temporarily or permanently, through biological and or technological means above and beyond normal physiology. And this is the punchline. So it has to be above and beyond normal physiological physiology of individuals, because they're all different. Now why is that important? Because it distinguishes it from, and people confuse the two, from restoration. Restoration medicine is fixing a dysfunction, either due to an injury, due to disease, or some sort of a genetic dysfunction. So this is a luxury exercise. Now, I've written that at ETH here in Zurich, that what I call inevitable transhumanism. Why is it inevitable? Because it taps into the very motivations, the Neuropre5 that I talked about. It is appealing to the human psyche and human motivations. But there are big problems with transhumanistic approaches, because this ties in, as the DARPA premise said, with partly autonomous or fully autonomous. So we have huge inequalities, as Anya brilliantly mentioned. So between the enhanced and the unenhanced. There are authenticity issues, because biology, and I've written for the West before, biology will be able to change what it means to be human. And so how human is somebody? Authenticity is an issue, fairness is an issue, meritocracy is an issue. How can you compare an enhanced and an unenhanced entity? And of course, from a neurobiological standpoint, epigenetic structural changes that we know result of any kind of intervention through any experience we go through. And some of those, as you know, are added to our genome and passed on to our offspring. So this could be a multi-generational issue also. Very quickly on neuromodulation and free will. Of course, free will, as you know, is our sense of agency, our sense of freedom, our sense of independence. And there are very potent neuro capable modulators, whether they're invasive or non-invasive, in other words, exogenous or endogenous. BCI, brain-computer interface, there's a great deal of hype, both in the corporate world and mostly in the military. The biggest two entities interested in this are the militaries of the world and corporate entities. Whether it's Neuralinks or Kernel or any of these entities, there is a huge gap between the hype, the marketing hype and claims, and real neuroscience behind it. It's really important to remember that there's a huge gap, but that's never stopped corporate hype in the past, and it won't in this case. Now, BCIs originated as an idea to fix dysfunction in neuro-architectural frameworks. And I am all for that, because there are conditions where it can be useful. But if it's a luxury like the transhumanistic approach, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, then we have problems, especially in the military, because of the lack of, because it's not open source often and lack of oversight. There are huge privacy issues because of these very sensitive biodata that actually are used and misused by corporate entities. there are neuro rights issue as a subset of human rights. This is a Columbia University initiative that I wrote about in Scientific American a few months back, and the state of Chile is to be commended because it took up this as a neuro rights bill in its parliament. And it's absolutely critical. Neuro rights is the most sensitive part of human rights. There's also biohacking, as Anya mentioned. And there are, as I mentioned earlier with transhumanism, there are permanent structural epigenetic changes that are irreversible and that are hugely consequential for the well-being and the psychodynamics of the individual. Finally, I'll just go to autonomous weapons, whether they're fully autonomous or partly autonomous. I call them artificial intelligent agents. And my neurophilosophical view of this, I wrote in a paper, and I don't have time to go through it in great detail, although I'll mention some highlights. And the title of that article, and whoever is interested can look it up, is what I call prerequisites for rights and dignity for artificial intelligent agents. The difficulty with this, I mean, it's like transhumanism. My belief, given what I know about the neurophilosophical foundations of human nature and of state behavior, given my work in international relations, is that autonomous weapons are here to stay. They're here to stay in more profound ways and more ubiquitous ways than we know or we like. And our best shot is, it's like transhumanism. It's like globalization. It's not, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Is it good or is it bad? It's going to happen. And it can be good, as Anya mentioned, but it can be horrible. And the big issues, Isabel mentioned very elegantly at the beginning of our session, there are accountability issues, there are liability issues, there are sovereignty issues, there are international law and Geneva Convention issues. There are extrajudicial killing issues. There is the potential of runaway technologies, things that get out of hand, even beyond people who write the source code. There is implicit bias, as Anya said, in all AI entities. There are errors. There are civilian casualties. And critically, and I'll end up with this, again, going back to the human element of all of this, there's likely to be in the battlefield extreme brutality as a result of this. I mean, the people who are for this, they advocate the selective nature of targeting, and that may be true in some instances, but even recent current affairs, you can tell how totally wrong we can be, despite the best intentions. I don't doubt all the good intentions, but it's not feasible. And even if it's not an error, the likelihood, removing the human element, as some of our distinguished speakers spoke about, will make extreme brutality highly likely now or in the future, and the ultimate dehumanization of killing, which will be a total disaster to our species going forward. And in human history, the degree of brutality in a particular conflict is intimately related to the ability to move on in terms of post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation. So the likelihood, my prediction is future wars using these autonomous entities will be highly brutal in more ways than we can imagine. And therefore, the scars and the post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation will be much more difficult. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nayef Al Rodan. Everyone, we have about 10 minutes to go, so I will be incorporating your questions right away. And the first question that we have is about what role can the public play, in particular youth, in supporting only peaceful use of artificial intelligence? And I'd like to direct this question to you, Mrs. Jones.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it fits in with what I was going to talk about next anyways, which was a question about kind of the power of civil society to have an impact in this problem. And I think that in my view, civil society is actually a really broad term, and it includes stakeholders like the public and like youth in particular, because civil society is this group of entities, which are basically any organizations that aren't affiliated or associated with government. So we often think about civil society as just NGOs or nonprofits, but really, civil society is inclusive of schools and universities, advocacy groups, professional associations, faith communities, cultural institutions, members of the public. So this is, a massive group of stakeholders that needs to be considered when we're talking about AI and a peaceful future. And I think in particular, for me, youth is a key subgroup there in that body of stakeholders, because when we're talking about fundamental shifts to the nature of warfare, the means and methods of warfare, as several of the other speakers have said, this is going to have impacts on future generations. For as far as we can see into the future, this is a transformative shift. And youth have a key role to play in the discussion in order to secure the future that they and future generations will be living in. So I think that it's fundamental that that youth, but also civil society broadly, as well as several of the other speakers also touched on the private sector in this case, because I think one of the things that's interesting and different or distinct about the issue of autonomous weapons compared to other issues in conventional arms control or disarmament more broadly is the unique dual use kind of nature and question of some of the technologies that are under development here. So of course, the private sector has a big role to play in this as well. So I think, of course, ultimately, states are the ones who are able to establish formal political positions and have the legal and legitimate authority to negotiate things like treaties and methods of regulation that create that normative structure that Anya was talking about. But we, civil society, youth, individual stakeholders, citizens of our own nations, we have the ability to influence these processes, to call on our governments to represent our interests, our futures, and to hold states to account. And I think if you look historically at disarmament and arms control bodies, civil society and youth movements in particular have played a significant role in raising awareness and advancing those disarmament and non-proliferation movements. And primarily, I think, in reframing disarmament from an issue of purely or primarily state security to one of human security. And as Anya said, this is a human issue. This is not just purely a technological issue. When we look back, civil society coalitions were fundamental in banning anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, adopting the Arms Trade Treaty, which regulates the international trade of conventional arms, the negotiation and adoption, most recently, of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I have to disagree slightly with the previous speaker in terms of the inevitability of these weapon systems. I think actually what's inevitable is that we will reach regulation. The question is just when that will happen. And I think that this is why it's so critical and crucial to include youth, members of the public, civil society, broad stakeholders in ongoing discussions in diplomatic arenas, the private sector, to be able to take into account the impact that the use of these technologies will have on all people, and the disproportionate impact that they will have on certain people. And I just want to end by saying it's also important to think about the kind of concerns that I've raised and that others have raised in this panel that some of you might share attending this event. That we're not alone in calling for or expecting regulation and normative response to these technologies that, as Anya said, we are developing, we're creating them. We have the ability to decide what we create and how we use it and how we regulate it. And those views are shared by numerous people across civil society and in the public, including the UN Secretary General, the International Committee of the Red Cross, thousands of scientists, faith leaders, military veterans, and also a growing number of states. So ultimately, it's up to states to make their voices heard in favor of regulation, demonstrate their commitment to begin negotiations of a treaty. But civil society, and I hope all of you as youth, as stakeholders in this process, will continue to call on states to do that. And of course, we in civil society will work with states towards that goal.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jones. And now I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Lutas. We have some questions about, is it possible to broker global agreements for peaceful use of AI? How is NATO balancing its understandable needs to keep up with technological progress with also those particular ethical concerns? And I would like to ask if we can keep the questions also a bit brief so we can stay on time.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. So I already mentioned that our strategy includes a number of principles for ensuring the responsible use of artificial intelligence, principles like lawfulness, responsibility and accountability, explainability and traceability, reliability, governability, and bias mitigation. What is very important for us is that those principles, as I said earlier, do not remain words on paper, do not remain commitments, but they become reality. And for that, we're taking action. So at the moment, we are setting up data and AI governance that will help address norms, processes, and tools to support the operationalization of our principles of responsible use of data and AI. We're looking at tools such as the risk assessments or impact assessments that would be conducted prior to deploying AI capabilities, but also during the life cycle. And that's also something that one of the other speakers mentioned. AI systems will probably be evolving throughout their life cycle. So it's not a one-off check that needs to happen, but a more systematic follow-up. We're looking into security certification requirements for AI, including audits for purposes of stress testing. And we're also looking at what the standard setting organizations are doing in this framework, and industry are doing in this context, especially looking at tools, standards, and processes for example, all those things like risk assessments and any sort of instrument or tool that will be used for operationalizing the principles, knowing and be very aware of the fact that actually the operationalization of those principles will be easier for some and harder for others. So for some of them, it's just much easier to validate and say, well, yes, this principle is met or not. And for others, it's much more difficult. And in this case, technology also poses limitations. If you think, for example, AI systems that will be using neural networks or multivariant support vector machines, where it's currently much harder to understand the really black box systems, whereas you have other options where things are more transparent. So that's from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nikos. And now I'd like to turn to you, senior fellow Casperson. There is a question about whether we can or how we can support a truly equitable conversation about peaceful use of AI without sustaining previous Western-centric ways. In your experience, how can we really foster that?
So I'll make this, in the interest of time, I do some bold statements. First, we need to get out of the ivory tower. That's the first one. There's too many of the discussions around AI and its ethics and its applications are still largely confined to a very specific group of stakeholders. So we need more informed public discourses. We need more engagement for youth, serious investment in civic education, digital AI literacy, diverse participation, as I mentioned earlier, lateral intelligence, scientific intelligence, anthropological intelligence, and not least transdisciplinary pursuits around the societal impact of AI. And when I say societal, I also mean the military aspects of it. We need to make sure that the public discourse on AI is also addressing downstream consequences and not just kind of locked into this rather myopic tech solutionist optimization approach where you don't actually ask the question if AI is the right answer to the problem that you're asking. There's too much of that going on, building on my previous comment. We also need to grapple with the fact that AI systems, and this goes to my sort of cautionary tale about believing all the science fiction tropes and sort of getting carried away with this existential risk approach, which is of course very important. But with the COVID pandemic, for example, we're seeing that the acceleration of AI systems and the acceleration of embedding AI systems into our daily lives have skyrocketed. But the maturity around how to govern it, or even to think about how that really impacts on us, and sort of this, as Nayef was commenting on, the sort of growth of this new economy around biodata has not been properly discussed. It's also an issue of like, who are those who are most vulnerable for negative impact? Are they included in the discussion as well? One big fear of mine, which is building on Nayef's, Professor Rodan's comment, was I fear that some of these technologies also allow us to instrumentalize othering, the division between us and them type of things. And NATO didn't speak of it, but NATO done some really interesting work around cognitive warfare. So meaning when our minds become a new domain of warfare, I really recommend people to look at the work that NATO has done in this space, and this scenarios exercise of thinking scenarios about what would that look like in the future. And of course, when you speak about how the mind can become a potentially new battlefield, be that through social media or, our reliance upon, technology to communicate with each other, that's some very important facets in terms of downstream consequences to tackle. So to sum up, we need to grapple with some of our blind spots. We need to ask ourselves, do we have the right platforms, the right people leading them? Have we empowered people to actually engage with these platforms meaningfully? We need to learn from previous experiences. I mentioned CERN earlier, but where we do responsible research and innovation, but with the right checks and balances in place. Isabel was referring to the dual-use technology and how dual-use technology, what I will call omni-use uses technology. Do we have the right type of normative frameworks? I mean, it's clear that what we're dealing with right now, what we're grappling with right now, is challenging our traditional notions of disarmament and arms control. That is without a doubt. It challenges how we think around deterrence. Can you actually speak of deterrence in this space? What does victory look like? What's the beginning and end of a war? What is war? And sometimes we are very busy trying to either create new concepts or trying to retrofit, what is happening into old concepts, as opposed to saying, do we have the right type of discussions, to be able to tackle what's really at our disposal? And also not fall for the temptation of thinking that everything needs to be new because we haven't seen this before, but actually building on what's already there. We also need to be clear on what I said, on what aspects of ethics that we are considering, which are being overlooked, and to be aware of the rules, values, and interests that we are embedding into both our discourses as well as the development of technologies. And if you just allow me, so I played quite a key role alongside former Ambassador Amadim Gill in coming up with these 11 principles that is now guiding the discussion on autonomous weapons that both Professor Rodan and Isabel was talking about. And I would just want to sort of encourage everyone listening to this conversation to actually take a look at them, because they're really good. And too often the discussion is kind of around just the first principle, the first guiding principle, which has to do with the human-machine interaction. But in fact, the guidelines is a really powerful baseline for furthering this discussion. And I would just want to sort of point your direction to point B, which goes on clarifying and making clear lines of accountability. Point C, as both myself and others were saying in this conversation, that human-machine interaction takes on various forms throughout the life cycle of the system and its application. Often overlooked in the guidelines is that it also speaks of cybersecurity and data spoofing, so non-physical security. What happens if the system is interfered with or intercepted with or tampered with? And also a very important point, which is that we should not be anthropomorphizing. This also goes to Rodan's comments, these technologies, which of course addresses issues such as deep fakes and other things that are increasingly playing a role in the battlefield. And these are very important points of departure for any discussion around interoperability between systems, which is part of the downstream consequences. Differentiated impact on people depending on where you are in your digital maturity and your digital systems maturity. Can we safely interrupt such systems, both and securely interrupt those systems? There's a difference between the two. And also are we ready? Do we have the equipment? Are we equipped to deal with some of the other unforeseen consequences when applying such transformative systems into imperfect environments, which often, a war-fighting context would be, especially taking into consideration, as Isabel was also referring to, and Professor Rodan, the increasing role of commercial applications that is being retrofitted into military applications, and how do you deal with those issues? And just very last point, so there's a fantastic initiative coming out of TU Munich, so the engineering university and all kinds of other programs in Munich, that is called Conscious Coders, so think tech. And given, your youth focus, etc., this is essentially some folks that used to work with me when I was doing disarmament that felt very motivated to try to bring the discussion to where they are, which is in their prime part of their studying or early professional careers. So they have all of these discussions that we are having right now within their student environment, bringing in people from legal, from engineering, from anthropology, from science, philosophy, neuroscience, into discussion saying, what are we studying? What are we learning? What are the ethics of all of this? And how are we going to tackle all of this as we enter into our professional careers? So to starting these initiatives already at university, to bring that with you as you enter into your professional careers, that's the way to engage youth. And there's certainly many, many other platforms to engage, but I think a lot of these discussions, like I said, get it out of the ivory tower, start talking about downstream consequences, and start doing it, in the early kind of professional years, and then be part of informing the discussions that happens elsewhere, including in your company or in your university environment. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the cast person. And if you don't have to go anywhere very soon, Professor Al Rodan, I'd like to give you the concluding remarks. With this final question, how can your philosophy help us craft a better path forward? Also connecting it to the question that was just asked in the chat.
Thank you, Maël. Yes, given what I just said about human nature, it's more, our moral compass, our motivations, our malleability, our fragility, our personal and political circumstances. I have previously conceptualized and published a governance paradigm, which I call dignity-based governance, which is applicable to societal norms, to global transnational issues, but especially to these disruptive, intrusive, and transformative technologies. And that is built upon the realization from a neurophilosophical standpoint that there is a tension, there's an ever-present tension between human nature attributes on the one side and human dignity needs. So the human nature attributes are emotionality, amorality, egoism, and to govern any entity, whether it's a technology or a society, these must be balanced with these individual dignity needs. So emotionality needs to be balanced by reason, security, and human rights. Our amorality, our predilections to amorality, it must be balanced by accountability, transparency, and justice, all relevant to autonomous weapons. And our egoism, which is self-interest, must be balanced by opportunity, innovation, and inclusiveness. Two final thoughts, take-home messages. One, always remember, from a human nature standpoint, by the way, that kind of dignity-based governance, I've already published it in the Journal of Public Policy as well as a book, and I took a look at 15 countries, some sophisticated, some not, to examine how well we do. I mean, most of these are part of democratic accountable principles, but you'll be surprised how very sophisticated entities don't apply them equally well or sufficiently. And that's where sometimes we fail in terms of governance. Going back to human nature, one sentence, and state behavior / corporate behavior, which are all relevant to this debate. Human nature, remember, its predictability, its malleability, and its fragility. And therefore, and its vulnerability to circumstances. We shouldn't be, in our high-fluting chairs and ivory towers, prescribing and critiquing human nature behavior anywhere. Human nature is the same everywhere. If we're vulnerable, we do silly things. There's a principle I had published before, which I called fear-induced preemptive aggression. Turns out when we're afraid, we do bad things. Fear is a central motivator of human behavior. And therefore, we need exogenous, accountable, equitable, and transparent governance paradigms, both at technology level, societal level, and we can dream at the global level, which is never going to happen anytime soon. So Isabel's point earlier, the inevitability I talked about isn't about the bad outcome. I think the need for autonomous weapons, both in peace and war, to me is a certainty, but it's not a certainty that they will get out of hand or will not be governed correctly. That's what I just want to clarify that. Finally, the triad, for state behavior, most of you who work in international relations understand that state behavior, international relations theory is premised on the rational behavior of states and most in the service of the national interest. And while that is true most of the time, states often, and have done so throughout human history, act emotionally and overreach in a way that actually sabotages the very national interest they aspire to achieve. It's really critical to remember that, and that's true of the militaries, and it's true from a different angle with corporate entities. There is a disconnect between the goals of corporate entities, militaries, and individual freedoms and dignity. And that is an age-old imbalance. And societies that succeed or have succeeded and continue to succeed are the ones who balance this. States are motivated by a lot of things, but they're motivated first and foremost by survival. For their cultural frameworks, for their histories, for the well-being of their citizens, by fear. And often, once those two are accomplished, by dominance. Human history has never been, people have never stopped from planning to dominate once they achieve the basic tenets of survival. And so that's in us. And the only way, again, because I'm not deterministic or reductionist, I always say this is the default position, this is the likely position, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable in terms of happening, but it will take a lot of work on everybody's part. Otherwise, we're in for a very brave new world that's not so uncertain and not so pleasant. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Al Rodan. It's very interesting, everything that you've mentioned, but also thank you to all our panelists for this session.